All right, let's go. Number 10. Bruno, from 2028. He arrived the way all of them arrive now. A darkened room. A single lamp placed low and to the side, so the face is a smear of shadow rather than a face. A voice pitched down and warped until it carries no accent, no age, no gender, nothing a listener could use to place him in the world. He gave a name, Bruno, and offered no surname, no city, no documentation of any kind. He said he had seen the year 2028. The videos circulated through the paranormal channels that specialize in this material, the ones built on the same template, the same lighting, the same digital distortion applied to the same kind of confession. He described a future of advanced technology, machines that had outpaced the people using them. He described pandemics. He did not name a pathogen. He did not name a country of origin, a month, a mortality figure, or a mechanism of transmission. He said there would be sickness on a large scale, and he said the world would be changed by it, and then he moved on to other matters. At the time, nobody paid much attention. The genre was already saturated. There were dozens of these figures, indistinguishable from one another, each claiming a different decade, each obscured behind the same visual grammar of secrecy. The claims were dismissed as content, which is what they were. Then the world got sick, and the footage came back. It was clipped, re-uploaded, subtitled, and shared with the annotation that a man behind a distorted voice had said the word pandemic before most of the planet had learned to say it every day. The retroactive fit felt uncanny to millions of viewers. It still does. It is the single most durable piece of evidence in the modern time traveler canon, and it is the reason his name survived when the others did not. What makes the Bruno case particularly unsettling is not the hit. It is the mechanism by which the hit was manufactured, and the fact that the mechanism required no deception on his part at all. He never predicted a specific event. He predicted a category: sickness, technology, disruption, unease. These are not forecasts. They are the load-bearing conditions of every century humans have ever recorded. A man who says there will be a pandemic within a decade is not seeing the future. He is describing the ordinary behavior of a species living in dense cities with fast aircraft. The prediction was designed, whether consciously or not, to be unfalsifiable. And an unfalsifiable prediction, given enough time, always comes true. This is the oldest technique in the trade. The cold reader does not tell you what happened. The cold reader offers a shape loose enough that you fill it in yourself, and then hands you the credit for the accuracy while keeping the authority for himself. The distorted voice is not there to protect an identity. There is no identity to protect. There is no birth record, no employment history, no independent witness, no corroboration of any kind. The distortion is there because obscurity reads as danger, and danger reads as truth. He is still out there in the archives, faceless, unverified, 6 seconds of warped audio that 1 million people have now heard as prophecy. And the reason it worked is not that he was clever, it is that we were ready. We were already frightened of something we could not name, already scanning the record for someone who had seen it coming, already willing to accept a shadow with a modulated voice as a witness. He did not warn us about the future. He told us what we already suspected, and we called it evidence. Number 9. Noah, from 2030. In late 2017, a series of videos appeared on a paranormal YouTube channel called Apex TV, featuring a young man who identified himself only as Noah. He said he was from the year 2030. He said he had been sent back, or had come back, or had been part of a program he was not permitted to describe in full. The details shifted between appearances. What did not shift was the presentation. His face was blurred. His voice was warped into a low mechanical register. He was filmed in a dark room, seated, lit from one side, against a background that revealed nothing about where he was or what year it might have been. The visual grammar was already familiar to anyone who had watched the earlier confession videos from the same channel. Obscured identity, degraded audio, minimal light, a figure claiming to carry knowledge from the far side of the present. But Noah added something the earlier cases had not. He submitted, on camera, to a lie detector test. This was the escalation, the apparatus of proof, imported wholesale into a format that had never previously needed it. There was a machine, there were electrodes, there were questions asked and answered while the needle moved. The footage was presented as verification, and for a certain audience it functioned as exactly that, because the polygraph carries the visual authority of a courtroom even when it is operating in a bedroom for an entertainment channel. His predictions were specific enough to be memorable and general enough to be safe. He said Donald Trump would be re-elected in 2020. He said Bitcoin would surge dramatically in value. He said artificial intelligence would come to dominate the coming decade. 2 of these have been circulated ever since as hits. They were not hits. By 2017, the year the videos were filmed, Bitcoin's ascent was the most discussed financial story on the internet, and the coming dominance of machine learning was the stated thesis of every major technology firm on Earth. Predicting them from the future required no future. It required a browser. The third prediction, the only one that was genuinely falsifiable, the only one that could not be assembled from the public speculation of the day, failed outright in November 2020. What makes the Noah case particularly unsettling is not that he was wrong, it is what the machine was for. The polygraph was not there to establish truth. Polygraphs do not establish truth, and no court in the United States treats them as though they do. The machine was there to perform the act of being tested. It was a prop borrowed from the imagery of institutional verification, deployed in an environment where no institution existed, to reassure an audience that someone somewhere had checked. The blurred face performed danger. The warped voice performed secrecy. The dark room performed clandestine urgency. And the polygraph performed rigor. Every element of the video was an image of evidence rather than evidence itself. The channel that produced it has published dozens of similar figures, filmed under similar conditions, making similar claims. The format was profitable. It remains profitable. The men in those chairs were never sent from anywhere. What lingers is not the failed prediction. It is how quickly the aesthetic of proof came to substitute for proof, and how little the substitution cost. A blurred face and a borrowed machine were sufficient to move millions of people through an argument they never examined. That was 2017. The tools have improved considerably since then. The audience has not. The next case required no camera at all. Only a newspaper willing to print it. Number 8. Sergei Ponomarenko and Kiev. The story, as it circulated, begins in 1958. A young man named Sergei Ponomarenko walked out into the streets of Kiev and did not come back. There was no note. There was no body. There was no explanation. He simply stopped existing in the ordinary way that people stop existing when a city loses them, and the record of his life, if there ever was one, closed. Then, according to the account, he reappeared. The year was 2006. 48 years had passed. He was still a young man. He was wearing the clothing of the decade he had left, unworn and unfaded, and he was carrying a small camera device that functioned in a way no camera of 1958 could have functioned. The story specified that the device worked, that it produced images, that among those images was a photograph of his fiancée, a woman who by 2006 would have been in her 70s, photographed as she had been in the year he disappeared. He was taken, the account continues, to a psychiatric hospital. He was assessed. He was examined by physicians who could not account for the clothing, the camera, or the calm with which he described a Kiev that had ceased to exist. And then, before any of it could be resolved, he disappeared again, out of a locked ward, out of the record for the second time. The story traveled with a single photograph, one image of a man in old-fashioned dress, styled to look like a print from the middle of the last century, reproduced across forums and aggregator sites and television segments for the better part of 2 decades. That photograph is the entire physical basis of the case. Skeptics have proposed that the account originated with a Ukrainian tabloid, and on this point the skeptics are not proposing. They are describing. The story traces to a tabloid. It has never been traced anywhere else. There is no police file from 1958. There is no missing persons entry. There is no hospital admission record, no physician's assessment, no discharge note, no name on a ward roster. There is no fiancé. There is no camera. There is no independent document of any kind connecting any real person in Kiev to any part of this narrative. Every institution that would have generated paper has generated nothing. What makes the Ponomarenko case particularly unsettling is not the disappearance, it is the craftsmanship. Because someone built this story carefully, and they built it out of exactly the right materials. A city with a fractured 20th century archive, where records genuinely were lost. A date far enough back that no one would expect to find the file. A woman left behind, to supply grief. A locked institution, to supply authority. A device that functions ahead of its era, to supply the impossible. And a single photograph, degraded just enough that examination becomes pointless. Nothing in it can be checked. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the design. The older tradition of the fabricated time traveler does not require blurred faces, or distorted audio, or a lie detector on a table. It requires only a newspaper, a date, and a place the reader cannot easily visit. It was printed. It looked printed. And for years afterward it was repeated by people who assumed that somewhere behind the retelling there was a document, because there is almost always a document, and nobody had thought to look. Nobody ever found one. The man in the photograph has never been identified. The ward he escaped from has never been named. He was never there. Number 7. The time-traveling hipster. In 1941, a municipal photographer in Canada recorded the reopening of a bridge. The occasion was ordinary. A small crowd had gathered at the railing to watch the ceremony, and someone had been assigned to document the event for the local record. The photograph entered an archive and stayed there for nearly 70 years, unremarkable, uncatalogued as anything other than what it was. Then, around 2010, the image was digitized and posted online. Within days, it had been reproduced on tens of thousands of pages, and it carried a new caption. The caption said the photograph contained a man who should not have been there. He stands slightly apart from the crowd. He is looking at the camera, and to a viewer in 2010, everything about him is wrong. He appears to be wearing modern wraparound sunglasses, the kind sold in every airport terminal in the world. He appears to be wearing a printed t-shirt with a logo across the chest. His hair is cut in a style that reads as contemporary. He is holding what looks like a compact camera. Around him, men in fedoras and heavy wool stare at the ceremony in the postures of another century, and he stands among them looking like a tourist who has wandered in from a different decade entirely. The image became one of the most circulated pieces of alleged photographic evidence in the history of the subject. It was called the strongest visual case ever made for time travel. It required no testimony, no confession, no forum posts, no interviews with distorted audio. It required only that you look. And that was the problem. Historians of costume and material culture examined the photograph and reached a conclusion that took very little effort to arrive at. Every item the man is wearing existed in 1941. Every item was commercially available, in Canada, to an ordinary person with an ordinary income. The wraparound sunglasses were a recognized style of the period, manufactured and sold throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. The garment across his chest is not a printed t-shirt. It is a sewn sports sweater with a stitched emblem, a common item of the era, produced by the thousands for clubs, schools, and athletic associations. The camera in his hand was a model available at the time. His haircut was available at the time. His entire appearance was, to any person standing on that bridge in 1941, completely uninteresting. Nobody in the photograph is looking at him. That detail was noticed early and dismissed as insignificant. It was, in fact, the entire answer. The crowd around him saw nothing worth turning their heads for, because there was nothing there. What makes the hipster case particularly unsettling is not the man in the photograph. It is the mechanism by which he became impossible. Nothing changed in the image between 1941 and 2010. The silver on the negative did not rearrange itself. The anomaly did not appear in the photograph. The anomaly appeared in the people looking at it. An entire generation of viewers had lost the ability to read the visual vocabulary of their own grandparents. They looked at a normal man in normal clothing and saw a violation of physics, because the alternative explanation that ordinary people in 1941 owned sunglasses was not available to them. They had no baseline. They had no reference. They had inherited a cartoon of the past, all fedoras and formality, and anything outside the cartoon registered as supernatural. This is worth sitting with, because it cuts in both directions. If a photograph from 1941 can be misread this badly after 70 years, the photographs being taken of us right now will be misread too. Our objects will become unrecognizable. Our postures will become inexplicable, and someone, decades from now, will find one of us in the background of an ordinary afternoon and conclude that we did not belong there. Number 6. The Chaplain Cell Phone Woman. In January 1928, Charlie Chaplin released a silent film titled The Circus. At the premiere, a camera crew filmed the crowd arriving, the ordinary work of promotional footage, in an era when a film premiere was still a civic event. The reel was archived. It sat unremarkable for more than 80 years, catalogued as behind-the-scenes material, of interest only to film historians and Chaplin completists. In 2010, the footage was posted online, and a single detail inside it became one of the most widely circulated pieces of alleged time travel evidence ever recorded. A woman in a dark coat and hat walks past the camera. She is visible for a few seconds. She is holding a small object to the side of her head, pressed to her ear, and her mouth is moving. She appears to be talking into it. She appears, to anyone who has spent the last 20 years of their life watching people do exactly this on every street in every city on Earth, to be on the phone. The mobile telephone network did not exist in 1928. The first cellular call would not be placed for roughly another 45 years. The first handset a consumer could carry and use in the manner this woman appears to be using her object was decades beyond the horizon of anything the engineers of 1928 were even attempting. The gesture in the footage corresponds to no available technology of its era. The footage itself is not in dispute. It is grainy, it is jerky, it is period silent film stock with the characteristic frame instability of the format, which means the movement is hard to read and the object is a dark smudge of a few pixels against a dark coat. But it is genuine 1928 film. Nobody serious has ever suggested otherwise. The woman is real. The object in her hand is real. The posture is real. Skeptics proposed an explanation almost immediately, and it is almost certainly the correct one. The object is a hearing aid. Portable electronic hearing amplifiers, built around carbon transmitters, existed in the 1920s and were available to anyone who could afford one. They were held to the ear. They were often held in the hand. A user testing the device, or adjusting it, or speaking to a companion just out of frame while holding it in place, would produce precisely the silhouette visible in the footage. What makes the Chaplin footage particularly unsettling is not the possibility that the woman came from somewhere else. It is that the gesture only reads as impossible to a viewer who knows one technology and does not know the other. The people standing beside her on that pavement saw a woman with a hearing aid. They did not turn. They did not stare. Nothing about her registered as strange, because in 1928, nothing about her was strange. The strangeness was manufactured entirely by the 82 years that passed between the shutter and the upload. That is the mechanism, and it runs in both directions. A century of documentation is now being scanned, digitized, and served to an audience with no working knowledge of the objects inside it. Every obsolete tool in every archival frame is a candidate anomaly. Every forgotten posture is a potential impossibility. We are not discovering visitors in the record. We are discovering the depth of our own ignorance about the recent past and mistaking it for a message. The woman was not warning anyone. She was walking to a film premiere, holding a device she needed in order to hear it. She has never been identified. She never will be. Number 5. Hoken Nordquist and the Meeting Under the Sink. In 2006, a Swedish man named Hoken Nordquist noticed water pooling beneath his kitchen sink. He opened the cabinet. He crawled inside to find the leak. What he said happened next has circulated for nearly 2 decades as the single best evidence time travel claim in the modern record. And the reason is simple. He came back with footage. Nordquist said the cabinet did not end where a cabinet should end. He said the space behind the pipes extended, opened, and delivered him somewhere else. And in that somewhere else, he said, he met a man, an older man, a man who identified himself as Hoken Nordquist at the age of 70, living in the year 2042. He filmed it on his mobile phone. That detail is what separated this case from every account that came before it. The Manhattan man in the Victorian suit left only a police file. The Oxford scholars in the Versailles garden left only a book. Nordquist left video. Dark, shaky video, shot in a cramped cabinet, the frame lurching between 2 faces in bad light. 2 men side by side, in a space barely large enough for one, and on both forearms, held up to the lens, the same tattoo. He also brought back a message and the message was not what the genre had trained anyone to expect. He did not describe ruins. He did not describe war or famine or a burned coastline or a species reduced to scavenging its own wreckage. He described a future that was peaceful. He described a world that was technologically advanced and fundamentally intact. He described, in effect, good news from 2042, delivered by a man who had lived long enough to be certain of it. The footage spread. It was examined, argued over, slowed down, frame-stepped. The tattoo was the anchor. Anyone can film a stranger in a cabinet. Not everyone can film a stranger with your own ink on his arm. It was an advertisement. The entire sequence, the leak, the tunnel, the older self, the matching tattoos, the reassuring news from 2042, was produced as part of a campaign for an insurance company. Nordquist was not a witness. He was the talent. The message about a peaceful, advanced future was not a warning carried back through a hole in a kitchen cabinet. It was a pitch about planning ahead, about the man you will one day become, about the value of preparing now for the person waiting for you at the other end of your life. A marketing stunt, not a warning. What makes the Nordquist case particularly unsettling is not that it was fabricated. It is what the fabrication cost and what it bought. Somebody sat in a room and decided that the most persuasive way to sell a financial product was to stage a meeting between a man and his own future. Somebody wrote the brief. Somebody budgeted the tattoo, the cabinet, the deliberately terrible lighting, because clean footage would have looked fake and degraded footage would look true. The shakiness was a design decision. The darkness was a design decision. The evidence was engineered to appear accidental. And it worked. It is still working. The clip still circulates, stripped of its origin, presented as testimony, believed by people who have never heard the word insurance attached to it. That is the mechanism worth noticing. Not that a man lied about crawling under a sink. That an institution with a budget discovered it, could manufacture proof of the impossible, release it into the record, and watch the record keep it. Once you can build the evidence, you no longer need the event. Number 4. Andrew Carlson and the Impossible Portfolio. In late January 2003, according to the account that has circulated continuously for more than 2 decades, federal investigators in New York arrested a man named Andrew Carlson on suspicion of insider trading. The charge, in itself, was unremarkable. Insider trading cases are filed constantly. What made this one extraordinary was the arithmetic. Over the course of 2 weeks of trading, Carlson was said to have turned an initial stake of $800 into $350 million. Every high-risk position had paid. Not most of them. All of them. Those numbers are worth sitting with, because they are the reason this story has outlived every other case in the genre. The most successful professional traders in the world, working with enormous capital and teams of quantitative analysts, treat a win rate slightly above chance as career-defining performance. Carlson, in the story, had no analysts. He had no visible source of information. He had no contacts inside any of the companies he traded. He simply chose correctly, again and again, in a market that punishes certainty. Investigators, the account continues, could not locate the leak. There was no network of informants. There were no intercepted communications. There was nothing to seize. So they asked him how he had done it, and he told them. He said he was from the year 2256. He said the early 21st century markets were studied in his era as a matter of historical record, which meant that every outcome he had bet on was already written down. He said he had not been gambling, he had been remembering. And then, in exchange for leniency, he offered his interrogators 2 things: the location of Osama bin Laden and a cure for AIDS. This is the point in the telling where the story usually stops, because it stops in exactly the right place. The man vanishes. The file closes. No credible photograph of Andrew Carlson has ever surfaced. No verifiable address. No employment history. No documentary trace of any kind. For 20 years, that absence has been presented as the most compelling part of the case. A man with no past. A man with no face. But the absence is not evidence of anything. The absence is what you find when a person was never there. The Andrew Carlson story originated in Weekly World News, a satirical tabloid whose stock in trade was invented news presented in the visual grammar of a real newspaper. The same publication printed stories about a half-bat child, about world leaders replaced by aliens, about ghosts in the Senate. Carlson was not a leak. He was not a suppressed file. He was a piece of comic fiction, written to be understood as comic fiction, printed alongside other comic fiction, in a paper that never claimed otherwise. What makes the Carlson case particularly unsettling is not the trades. It is what happened to the byline. Because once the story was retold, the source fell away. The satire was quoted by outlets that had not checked where it came from, and then quoted again by outlets quoting those outlets, until the joke had been laundered through enough repetitions that it arrived looking like a court record. The numbers survived the journey intact. $800, $350 million, 26 trades that never happened, in a market that never noticed, executed by a man who was never born. Nothing about the story was hidden. The original page said what it was. It simply stopped being read, and a satirical invention became a widely repeated fact through no mechanism more sinister than fatigue. That is the pattern worth watching. Fiction does not need to disguise itself. It only needs to be repeated by people in a hurry. Number 3. Rudolph Fentz in Times Square. The story has been told so many times, in so many books, by so many authors who never questioned it, that it has acquired the texture of a police file. A man appeared in Times Square in the 1950s. He was in his late 20s. He was wearing clothing that belonged to another century, a Victorian suit, heavy sideburns, a top hat, the whole silhouette of a gentleman from the 1870s standing in the middle of post-war Manhattan traffic. He looked around. He appeared confused by what he was seeing. He stepped into the street and was struck by a car and killed. That was the beginning of the story, not the end of it. The end of it was in his pockets. According to the account, investigators searching the body found currency that was no longer in circulation, banknotes of a denomination and design that had not been printed in living memory. They found a bill from a livery stable for the care of a horse. They found business cards printed with an address where no such business had ever operated. They found identification in the name Rudolph Fentz. They checked the city directories and found no Fentz. They checked older directories, and in one of them they found a widow who told them her father-in-law had walked out one evening in the 1870s and had never come home. He had been 29 years old. He had been wearing a Victorian suit. It is a perfect story. That is the first warning sign, and nobody noticed it for decades. The Fentz case was reproduced in paranormal literature throughout the second half of the 20th century. It appeared in anthologies of unexplained phenomena. It appeared in books on time slips, in encyclopedias of the strange, in serious-looking volumes with footnotes and indexes. It was described repeatedly as a documented police record, a case file from the Missing Persons Bureau, an official investigation that had produced an official impossibility. Writers cited other writers. Each citation looked like corroboration. None of them was. Researchers eventually did the thing none of the authors had done. They went looking for the file. There was no file. There was a short story. It had been published in 1951 by the science fiction writer Jack Finney, a working professional whose entire craft was the construction of ordinary men displaced in time. The livery bill, the obsolete banknotes, the widow in the old directory, the sideburns, the top hat, the car. Every detail that made the case feel like evidence was an authorial choice, made deliberately, for effect, by a man who was paid to make things feel real. What makes the Fentz case particularly unsettling is not that it was fiction, it is how the fiction traveled. Somewhere in the chain, one writer encountered the story without its byline. He retold it as fact. The next writer cited him. The next cited that one. Within 2 decades, the story had a police captain attached to it, a bureau, a jurisdiction, an air of institutional confirmation. It had become a source. Other researchers built on it. And the reason nobody caught it for so long is the simplest reason in the world. Nobody checked. Everybody assumed somebody already had. This is the longest-running laundering operation in the genre. A story invented on a typewriter, stripped of its author, dressed in the vocabulary of official record, and cited for half a century as proof. There was no Rudolph Fentz. There was no evening walk in the 1870s. There was no body in Times Square. There was only a writer, working alone, who was very good at his job, and an audience that wanted the file to exist more than it wanted to look for it. Number 2. Bielek and the Eldridge. In the decades after the Second World War, A story began to circulate about a destroyer escort called the USS Eldridge. The claim was that in 1943, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, the United States Navy had generated an electromagnetic field of sufficient intensity to remove the ship from ordinary space. Not camouflage, not radar deflection, removal. The vessel was said to have vanished from the water entirely and returned some seconds later, having been somewhere else. The Navy has repeatedly and consistently denied that any such experiment took place. The denial has never softened. It has never been qualified. It has been issued in the same flat language for the better part of 80 years. And into that denial stepped a man named Bielek. Bielek did not claim to have heard the story. He claimed to have been aboard. He spoke on the lecture circuit for years, describing the deck of the Eldridge as the field came up, describing a glowing green fog that gathered around the hull and thickened until the ship was inside it. He described the sensation of the vessel losing its position in the world. He described what happened to the men who were standing in the wrong place when it did. Then, the account went somewhere no other Philadelphia experiment witness had gone. Bielek said the displacement had not simply moved him across geography, it had moved him a long time. He said he had jumped forward to the year 2137. He said he had jumped forward again, further, to 2749. He described cities he had walked through in those centuries. He described coastlines that no longer existed, shorelines drowned by a climate that had continued warming long after anyone alive in 1943 had stopped worrying about it. That detail is the reason the Bielek story has outlived the other versions. He was describing flooded coasts to lecture audiences in an era when the phrase climate change carried none of the weight it carries now. To an audience in the present, it reads as a hit. Military historians and researchers who examined the documentation reached a different conclusion. The paper trail for the Eldridge in 1943 exists, and it places the ship in ordinary service, doing ordinary things. Bielek's account, meanwhile, shifted. Names moved, dates moved. Details that had been central in one telling were absent in the next, and details that had never appeared before arrived fully formed. The story grew as the questions grew, absorbing each new objection into itself. It is widely considered a fabrication. What makes the Bielek case particularly unsettling is not the claim about the ship. It is the mechanism by which the claim survived. A story that changes cannot be caught. Every inconsistency became evidence of suppressed memory. Every missing record became evidence of a program that had scrubbed its own records. Every official denial became confirmation, because a program of that nature would deny it. The account was built, whether by design or by accident, so that nothing in the world could count against it. That is the shape of a story engineered to be permanent, not accurate, permanent. And it is worth noticing which part of Bielek's testimony we now repeat. Not the green fog, not 2749, the flooded coastlines. We remember the one detail that the intervening decades happened to dress in credibility, and we forget the rest, and in the forgetting we convert a man who kept changing his story into a man who saw something. He lectured for years. He was never verified, he was never definitively silenced. He simply told a story that could not lose. Number 1. John Titor. From 2036. On November 2, 2000, a user appeared on an internet discussion forum devoted to time travel and made a claim that should have died within the hour. He said he was a soldier. He said he had been sent back from the year 2036. He said his mission was to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer, a machine his era required to read and debug legacy code inherited from the last century. It was a small, strange, oddly practical errand. Not conquest, not rescue. A hardware acquisition. He posted for roughly 4 months. Under the name John Titor, he described his vehicle in engineering terms. A modified 1967 Chevrolet, fitted with what he called a gravity distortion device. He posted grainy black and white photographs of the unit installed in the car. He posted hand-drawn technical schematics with labeled components and operating parameters. He answered questions from engineers, physicists, and hobbyists who spent months trying to break him. He answered in the register of a man describing equipment he had actually maintained. Then he said he was going home, and the account went quiet, and it has been quiet ever since. What he predicted is the part everyone remembers, and it is also the part that failed. He said the United States would fracture into a civil war beginning around 2004. He said the conflict would escalate through the decade. He said it would culminate in a major nuclear exchange in 2015, one that would reduce cities to administrative memories and reorganize the surviving population into small agrarian communities. None of it happened. There was no civil war in 2004. There was no nuclear conflict in 2015. The dates arrived on schedule and passed without incident, and the world he described did not appear on any horizon. As a forecast, the Titor material is not ambiguous, not partially correct, not open to generous reading. It is simply wrong, in the specific, testable places where it committed itself to being right. Investigators went looking for the author. The trail led to a Florida lawyer and his brother, a family with the technical literacy and the narrative discipline the posts required. The identification was never confirmed. Nobody confessed. Nobody was charged with anything, because inventing a soldier from 2036 is not a crime. What remains is the most elaborate hoax the internet has produced, and one of the very few that has never been formally closed. What makes the Titor case particularly unsettling is not the prediction. The prediction is dead. It is the durability of the story after the prediction died. Because 2004 came and went, and the legend grew. 2015 came and went, and the legend grew again. New readers arrived who did not know the deadlines had already been missed, and they found the schematics, and the grainy photographs, and the 4 months of unbroken composure under interrogation, and they found it persuasive. The failure of the forecast did not damage the document. It freed it. Once the specific dates were gone, all that remained was the mood, a soldier from a broken future, describing a country that had stopped recognizing itself, addressing an audience that felt increasingly ready to be described that way. Titor did not warn anyone about anything that came true. He warned them in a voice that felt true, and that turned out to be enough. The posts are still archived. They are still time-stamped. They are still being read by people who arrive at them the way pilgrims arrive at a shrine, looking not for evidence but for confirmation of something they already suspected about the years they are living in. The man was never found. The story never needed him. Line up all 10 cases beside each other, and the pattern assembles itself without effort. The footage is always blurry. The voice is always distorted. The face is always obscured. The lighting always poor. The recording always made on a device that happened to be failing at the exact moment it was needed most. And the predictions are always vague enough to fit almost any outcome. A war, a collapse, a plague. A machine that thinks. Names withheld, dates omitted, mechanisms unexplained. Say that something terrible is coming, and something terrible will always arrive, and the arrival will be counted as a hit. Where the dates were specified, they failed. Titor named years, and the years came and went without his war and without his weapons. Where the sources were traced, they dissolved. Carlson came from a satirical tabloid, printed for amusement and mistaken for reporting. Fentz came from a short story published in 1951, fiction retold so often it acquired a case file. Nordquist came from an advertising campaign, a man under a sink selling a product. What makes the pattern particularly unsettling is not that the stories were false. It is why the false ones travel and the true ones do not. Real forecasting exists. It is done in institutions, in models, in tables of probabilities and confidence intervals, and it is specific, and it is boring, and it does not go viral. It says a number and a margin of error. It offers no tunnel behind the cabinet, no soldier in a Corvette, no man from 2256. It cannot be dramatized, so it is not watched. These stories thrive precisely because they are unspecific, because a warning without detail can never be wrong, because a prophecy that names nothing can be filled, year after year, with whatever the present happens to be afraid of. The mystery was never whether time travelers exist. The mystery is why the same trick keeps working on all of us, in every decade, in every language, on people who consider themselves difficult to fool. It is still working. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.